Alrighty, now that we're finished with the HTML and CSS, the goal of this video is to actually get quotes from an outside source. And I'm also going to show you how you can get quotes locally. The benefit of that is that you'll be able to actually customize the quotes yourself. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the API I've chosen for us to actually get our quotes from. So I found this API just Googling around. There are several out there that you could use. Keep in mind that the format that the data is returned in will be different with different APIs. So you might not be able to use exactly the code that I'm using here, but hopefully you will understand the concept that you just need to match what is being returned. So you can see here, if we press the Fetch Quotes button, we can see that it didn't return just one quote, it actually returned a list of quotes. So that means this data is being sent back in an entire array of quotes. That means we're going to need to do a little bit of work to take that array, store it, and then pick one quote randomly every time we press our new quote button. There are lots of quote APIs out there where you wouldn't have to do that because some of them will actually just deliver a single random quote at a time, and so that would be a little bit of a different process. If we go to this next page here, you can actually see this is the format that it's being returned in. This is actually the link to the API itself, and you can see that it's breaking it up into objects within an array, and each object includes a text value and an author value. So that's what I'm saying. Keep in mind when you're using a different quote API, it might just return one thing that is text. It might call it quote. You just need to check what's being returned and make sure that you are using the correct syntax with the data that you have. Okay, so let's jump over to our code and see if we can get this implemented into our project. Okay, so we're going to start in the JavaScript here. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to comment out a title. We're going to use command ? Or control ? depending on if you're Mac or Windows. And we are going to say that we're going to get quotes from API. And to do this, we're going to use an asynchronous fetch request within a try-catch statement. So what does that mean? An asynchronous function can run at any time independently, and it won't stop the browser from completing the loading of a page. So for now, we'll need to write async function, and then we'll name our function getQuotes, and then we'll have our brackets here, space, and then we'll have curly brackets, and then we will press enter. The next thing we'll need is our API URL. So I'm going to have constant here for API URL, and that's going to be equal to single quotes here, and we're actually going to jump back to the browser, and I'm just going to copy this address here. I will provide all the links, of course, within the course, and we will paste that there. And then now we're ready to set up our try-catch statement and our fetch request inside. So a try-catch allows us to attempt to complete a fetch request, but if it doesn't work, we can catch the error information and do something with it. So you see that we have our try, and then we have our catch, and then in brackets, we're going to pass in the error that would get received. And in this case, I'm just going to comment out that this is where you would handle your error. In a production website, you'd potentially pass that into an alert. So something like this, and then you would pass in your error, or you would actually pass it into some other kind of specific UI element that you created to show users of any issues with functionality. But in this case, we're focused more on just generating a quote, so we're not going to worry about that in this project. Now that we have our API URL here, we need to set up our actual fetch request inside of our try statement. So we're going to start with a constant for a response, and this is going to be equal to await fetch, and then we're going to pass in our API URL. So this means that this constant will not be populated until it has some data fetched from our API. So that means by default, if we did not do asynchronous and we did not do await, it would try to set this response value before it had a chance to fetch, and that would cause an error. So in this case, we're only setting the response constant when we actually have data and it can actually be set, or else it would just be undefined. Next, we're going to use a global variable here, and this is going to be called API quotes, and this is going to be equal to await response.json and then brackets there. So what that means is we are getting the JSON from our API as a response, and then we're turning that response into a JSON object, because from a web server, it's actually just a series of strings, as we saw in the other one. And then we're going to pass that into a global variable called API quotes. So we're actually going to need to create this above in order for it to be available in every function and not just in this function. So we're going to use a let here instead of a constant, and we're going to call it API quotes, and this is going to be equal to an empty array. The reason that we're using a let statement for this variable instead of a constant is because in the beginning we're setting it as an empty array, but here we're actually changing the value of it to pass in the quotes. You would only use a constant if the value is never changing, like our API URL here. And then the last thing we're going to do in this function is we want to console log API quotes. You can see it auto-completed for me there. The very last thing we need to do before we can check it out is on load, so I'll comment out another title here below. We want to actually run our getQuotes function as soon as the page loads. So we'll need to set it up here like this. Okay, so we're ready to save it and check it out. Okay, so we're going to right-click and inspect to have a look at our console here. And you can see that we have returned something. It is an array with 1,643 objects inside of it. So if we expand this, we can see that we have all of these objects. If we expand further, you can see that they're all indexed and they have a text value and an author value, just like we saw in our JSON on this web page here. Perfect. So that's working. We are actually pulling in that array of objects. But the next step is we actually only want one at a time. So if we go back, we can actually use an index number by adding square brackets and then a random number. I'm just going to pick the number 12. And this is going to log one specific quote in this array. That is the 12th quote, or I guess it's the 13th quote because it's a zero indexed array. But it's just going to pull out one this time. So let's save it and make sure that's working as expected. Okay, so you can see instead of an array, now we just have one quote and we can see the text and the author. Awesome. So this is what we want for our project, just one quote at a time. But we want it to be random every time. We can't just assign the index manually each time. So what we're going to do is we're going to break this out into another function so that we're only running the fetch request once, and then we're going to use another function that is going to pull a single quote from our local API quotes array. And that's the function that's going to get triggered every time we press the new quote button in the UI. So we're going to start with jumping back to the code. And instead of console logging here, we're going to delete this and we're going to replace it with what our new function is going to be called, which will be new quote. And then above this, we're going to actually create that function. So we're going to call this function show new quote. And we're going to create function new quote bracket, space, curly bracket, and press enter. So how this is going to work is we are going to need to do a similar thing with the index of the array, but we want it to be dynamic. And in order to do that, we're going to need to use some math functions. So if we jump back to the browser, we can see here that we have on this page here an article linking to math.random. So this is a math function that returns a number between 0 and 1. So it's going to return this number to a lot of decimal points. You can see something like this here. And then in turn, we're going to use that to multiply by the length of our API quotes array so that it will never be a higher number than the number of quotes that we actually have. We're going to need to combine this, though, with math floor. So math floor is important because it allows us to return the largest whole number or integer that is less than or equal to a given number. So for example, if we multiplied 1643 by 0.5201, etc., we're going to get a number with a decimal place. So what we'll need to do is wrap our math random in a math floor in order to make sure, so like in this case, it's 5.95. If we ran math floor on that, it's going to return just 5. So we'll need to do that in our project. Okay, so let's dive back to the code and implement that. So first, we're going to comment out a title here, and this is going to be to pick a random quote from API quotes array. And we're going to assign a constant called quote. And this is going to be equal to API quotes and then square brackets, because essentially what we're doing in the square brackets is we're making index, just like how I had 12, but this time we're doing it dynamically. And so that's going to be math floor. So remember, we have to wrap our math random in math floor to make sure it's a whole number. And we're going to do math.random, another set of brackets, and then a space, and then times. So this is the number 8 on your keyboard. So shift and then 8 to create the asterisk. And that's for multiplication. And then we're going to do API quotes dot length. So if you remember, it was 1643 was the amount of objects in our array. And then we'll add at the end here a semicolon. Lastly, we will just console log our quote to see if it was working correctly. Okay, so let's save that and check it out. Okay, awesome. So we can see that we got a different quote from last time. This is a Carl Jung quote this time. And if we were to refresh the page, you can see that we got another different quote. Awesome. So that is working exactly as we want. We're able to pull a single random quote from an array of quotes that we just fetched from an API. So from here, you could actually continue on to the next lesson. But the one last thing I would like to show is how we can accomplish a similar thing, but using an array that exists locally in our project. So you might have noticed in the index.html file, at the very bottom, we have a script source for a quotes.js file. And in the template project that you should have downloaded to start this project, we will see that in this quotes.js file, that essentially we just have a constant called local quotes, which is an array of objects. And it's actually the exact same format as before. I've just copied and pasted this from the API we're using, though this has a lot less quotes. Instead of 1600, it maybe has 100 or so. You can see that some of the authors are null. That's something we will tackle in the next video. But the benefit of using something like this is that you can actually customize the quotes yourself and just change the text and the author field. So I wanted to provide this as an option just in case you want to do something that is customizable, and it also doesn't need a fetch request, and if this other API we're using goes down, you can still use this instead. So we can close this because we don't need to modify this. But back in our JavaScript, we're actually going to simplify our code quite a lot. So if you are using this local array, we can actually comment out this entire getQuotes function, and we can comment out our getQuotes on load. So instead, we would need to have new quote on load. And then we can also get rid of this. We no longer need the API quotes global variable. And the last thing we'll need to change, instead of API quotes, so I'm going to highlight this and I'm going to use Command D or Control D, depending on if you are Windows or Mac. And I'm just going to change this to be local quotes instead of API quotes. So now we can save that and check it out. Okay, cool. So we can see that it's still working. We have our text and we have our author. And if I were to refresh, you can see that it loads even faster because we're actually not pulling it from a fetch request. We're just pulling it locally, so it works instantly. So you can see I'm refreshing multiple times and we have multiple quotes very, very quickly. Awesome. So I will leave the choice up to you whether you want to use the local method that I've shown you here or whether you want to use the fetch request like I had previously. If we jump back to the code, I'm actually going to undo all of these changes and I'm going to stick with the fetch request because it has more quotes and the API also has the possibility of being updated as time goes along. So that's the other benefit of using an API. It's also better to use locally if the API stops working or if it has problems, you have something else to fall back on. Okay. So in the next one, we're going to tackle populating our UI with the current quote, as well as adding our Twitter integration. All right, so I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.